Good morning, all. It's an absolute pleasure for me to have all of you with us today for this very interesting launch of a report on state of foundational literacy and numeracy. My immense gratitude to Dr. Vivek Debroy for really giving us insights over a period of time. But of course, I'm sure we are waiting for some criticism that is going to come from his side, of course, and being an academic does that. And we always look forward to that. But then if you really look at this body of work, this is something that has happened for the first time, wherein we are trying to rank the states in terms of like how they are performing on the foundational literacy. So this is a very interesting step towards that direction to really understand as to how things are happening. And why does it really have a huge level of relevance? It has huge level of relevance for a simple reason that if we get the foundational literacy right, we actually get quite a lot of things right in terms of how the future would actually, or what is the demographic dividend, how we are able to really extract the demographic dividend and so on and so forth. And it also has huge economic benefits. So that's where this body of work actually comes in. In fact, I also would like to thank some of my colleagues who've really worked on this body of work with me. So we have Nidhi, who's joined online. She worked with us on this. We have Ashish here, who as well helped with a lot of insights. And Sheen, my young colleague at the Institute, who helped us. But I would also like to thank two very special people who joined us here. So Sonali Nag, who's a professor from Oxford, and Sanwal from NCERT, who joined us. But before we move ahead, in fact, I wanted to request Pavanji to make some remarks or some ideas that you would like to share.
Can this be...
So we can just keep it.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm Pavan Kumar Sen. I'm Joint Secretary in EACPM. Basically, the idea was pioneered by Chairman EACPM. We should sign this MOU with the IFC, and immediately we started working on that. And this is the first report which is going to be released today. And we are looking forward to see so many reports and many academic works and support from IFC side in near future. We will. This is the beginning, and I believe and expect from IFC to make us read more such type of reports and go ahead with such projects which can be implemented in our country. Basically, when this report came initially, our focus was to have something in social sector which can be implemented at grassroots level, which many times we see that reports are limited in papers, but when we implement or execute at grassroots level from administrative side, it is very difficult to see the results. So I requested Mr. Kapoor also that when we are presenting this report, at least some recommendations should be there, at least some changes should be seen at ground level, where school or at learning stage, one can see changes. So I'm looking forward to see these changes, and thank you, Chairman sir, for accepting this request, and thank you for all to joining us in this morning. Thank you.
Okay. So I think as we move ahead, we would formally release the report, and then I'll request Ashish, I'll request Dr. Debroy and Pavanji to help us unveil the thing. Just
how do we unveil it? Just hold it up.
Just hold it up. I think that would be the best. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And without further ado, can I just request Dr. Debroy to make his remarks on how he really looks at this body of work. And so we would like you to be as candid as possible into like how we can really improve it over a period of time and be part of the story of bringing change that we actually are looking at.
Thank you, Dr. Kapoor, and good morning, everyone. As Pawan already mentioned, we've entered into an understanding with the Institute for Competitiveness, once the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister was reconstituted. In the past, also Amit Kapoor and the Institute for Competitiveness has done some work for us. And we entered into an agreement with them that they should once in a while do reports that are of use to us. And as Pawan said, reports that lead to some policy suggestions so that they lead to actual improvements. And this is, as has been said, the first report. It being the first report, firstly, it's laudable that the first report has been brought out so quickly. Secondly, it's laudable that this first report focuses on something we know is important to all of us as a country, which is the issue of foundational literacy, defined as, let's say, the age groups of 3 to 8. So it is sort of preschool, and then depending on the definition, up to grade 2 or grade 3. Not entirely, but partly in the ranking it does of states. It uses data from ASER. ASER, as we know, is a rural-based survey. And it's a survey, so this is subjective data. And I will come back to this later on. In the various variables that I use to construct the index, there are objective data and there are subjective data. The moment one begins to splice the two, one has to be a little bit careful. One reason for that is this attempt to gauge foundational learning is based on questions that are asked about literacy and numeracy. Quite often, the responses are contingent on the kinds of questions that are asked and the language that they are asked in. And one of the things I would have looked for in this report, because it depends on ASER, is what kind of questions did ASER ask and in what language. India, before COVID, was thinking of participating in PISA again. I don't know post-COVID what has happened. But pre-COVID, there was a pilot, I think it was in the year 2011, in 2 states. And the results of that pilot were that the responses were extremely conditional on the language in which the questions were being asked. More so for literacy, less so for numeracy. So I would suggest that in future, any such report that is done, let us have a handle on the kind of questions that are asked. I also have an issue with certain value judgments that are implicit. Let me give an example of that. Let me take a related issue, the issue of health. This is on education, but health also figures in this. And remember, when we are basing something, when we are looking at something like this, it's not based on panel data. It is cross-section at one point in time. And I suddenly find a figure which says stunting has worsened. Stunting has worsened over time. And I necessarily regard this as a bad thing because stunting is bad. I should not have stunting. I should not have wasting. But think of the counterfactual. We know that the infant mortality rate has been coming down. And there are infants who would have otherwise died, presumably from deprived sections. Now they are not dying, they are surviving. And almost tautologically, those infants who are now surviving, who would have died otherwise, would be susceptible to more stunting and wasting. Now, I cannot control for this, but I need to at least acknowledge it. And the same thing occurs for something like literacy and numeracy. We know that gross enrollment rates have been going up, have been increasing, probably from sections which would otherwise not have had access to school education. Those deprived sections, because we do not learn only from Anganwadi or school, we learn from the environment also. And at least I should acknowledge that there is a control issue and not be so categorical. The next point I would like to make is about the correlation between literacy and positive economic externalities. I'm citing evidence mostly from other countries, and that evidence is beyond question. Even if there were no positive economic externalities, literacy is an end in itself. However, I think I should also recognize that there is not a great degree of correlation, at least in India, between literacy and skills. So per se, literacy as defined by curriculum in any educational institution does not necessarily lead to skills that are valued as such by the market. And again, this is not a critique of what has been done. I'm just saying that one needs to also recognize this point about a lack of correlation between literacy and skills. I now come to another point about decrease in women's labor force participation rate. This is a phenomenon that's been going on for a long time. The first time it was recorded, if I recall, was in NSS 99. If I'm going to try and make sense of this, and I'm making a value judgment on this, I think I need to slice this into different age groups, because we know that enrollment in higher education has been going up phenomenally. So if I find there is a decrease in women's labor force participation rate in ages up to, let us say, 24, I cannot categorically assert that is necessarily a bad thing. I know that female work participation rates are low. I know they should be higher, but I think the case would be stronger if I disaggregated and made that argument not about women's labor force participation rate in general, but about, let us say, plus 21 or plus 24. I now come to a point about child labor. On child labor, I have a statistical problem and I have a methodological problem. Statistically, the figure that is cited is census 42.7 million, census 2011. Just check that, because the census figure I don't think is 42.7 million, it's around 38 million, but just double check that figure. But secondly, this is a point that UNICEF made, that this census was conducted in the months of April, May, and June, when children who were in standard 5 were not counted. So if one adjusted for it, the figure would not be 42.7 million, but 29.1 billion. It doesn't matter, that's a minor statistical problem. I think the most serious problem is, why are we saying child labor is bad? All of us at some point have watched Home Alone and its various versions. That's child labor, isn't it? Of course it's child labor. No one abuses that as child labor. In the US, all the time, school kids deliver newspapers. Well, I don't know whether people still need to. We say that's child labor, it's bad. We don't. So I think we should not bark up the wrong tree. Child labor is bad if children work in hazardous processes and occupations. Child labor is bad if it leads to children dropping out of school. Only then. And indeed, India is a signatory to the ILO convention, but let us not unnecessarily flag the child labor issue as child labor. It is an issue because children are dropping out of school. They're being deprived of education. I become even more skeptical because then there is an assertion in this which says that COVID is driving child labor up. And where is that based from? That is based on Africa. Where is the child labor in India? Some of it is on farm, within the family. Now, as far as I'm concerned, COVID would have done nothing to that. Where is the other child labor? It's in garments, it's in fireworks, it is in the roadside stalls, hospitality. All of those have suffered as a result of COVID. All of those have suffered as a result of the lockdown. All of them have employment problems in general. And now if someone tells me COVID has driven child labor up there, I find it impossible to believe. It flies against all evidence. It may have happened in Africa, but this is a report. It's an Indian report. Now I come to midday meal. The midday meals, the objective is a health objective. Of course, it is linked to this. There are also assertions that COVID has affected foundational learning. Of course, it has. But it has affected learning across the board. It is not something that is specific only to these age groups. So I think one should make that point. I have a point about I'm running out of criticism, don't look so worried. Then there are sections on the digital divide. And digital divide, I think again one needs to be a little bit careful. Some of the assertions are about schools having computers, schools having internet. But am I necessarily going to access learning methods through school computers or internet? Or am I going to do it through the mobile phones, smartphones? You have mentioned Diksha. So the issue is not per se whether the schools have computers or internet connections. I know that's an easy source of data from DICE. But somehow the Diksha and the school computers, internet, they don't tend to match. Now I come to the index, and because that is the index is the crux of it. And the index is based on 5 pillars. One is some of it comes from DICE. Education infrastructure, I have no issues. Access to education, I have no issues. Basic health, I have no issues, apart from what I said about stunting wasting. Now I have learning outcomes. Learning outcomes, in addition to what I have said about Acer, it's rural. In a state that I know of, West Bengal, since the days of the left front government, the West Bengal government has concentrated on rural schools. So if you look at the track record of students who topped the board exams, all rural, Calcutta is over and done with. So if I'm basing it with learning outcomes based on Acer, which is rural, I'm probably imparting a bias against states that are more urbanized. I don't know what is the answer to that, but at least I should recognize that there is a bias that is creeping in. And I'm not at all surprised that something like West Bengal should top the list. A, because of what I've just said, and B, on governance, I have expenditure. The issue is not expenditure, the issue is expenditure on what? The West Bengal government has spent ostensibly on school education by jacking up salaries. So obviously, West Bengal, that's my variable, will be at the top of the list. Has it led to any improvement in outcomes? I doubt it very much. So these are just some thoughts that I had. Some of them are about a little bit better sense of the statistics and the nature of the data. Some of these are about the value judgments, and some of these are what policy does one end up with, because those value judgments lead to the policy recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Debroy, for this very insightful set of points, because I think it does really give us a lot of food for thought in terms of like how do we really improve this body of work as we go along. And I have to concur with you on most of the points that you've actually said, especially on the learning outcomes per se, because when we are talking about ASER, it is rural and we are actually creating that bias, which should not happen. So there has to be a clear-cut understanding that has to be built. And of course, looking at the data, which is far more robust and creating that. But I think still, as I see it, it is a thing, or it's a body of work which is setting a direction in terms of it at least gives the idea that foundational learning and numeracy is important as we really go along. But thanks a lot for your points, and we'll take care of it as we move along and possibly do a second cohort of this. But if, with your permission, can I request, can we just start the panel discussion?
Of course.
Yes. So can we have Dr. Sanwal, Dr. Nag, Dr. Vinayak on video, please? So just a very quick thing here. So thanks a lot for all of you to join us today. I just wanted to give a brief introduction to everybody. In fact, Nidhi is an expert on education, literacy, and things, and she also works for an enterprise called Room to Read. We have Dr. Sanwal, who is a professor with Department of Elementary Education within CERT. Once again, a foremost expert in the area of education. And we have Dr. Sonali Nag, who's a professor of education and psychology, if I get it right, at the University of Oxford. But Dr. Nag is somebody, in fact, I should share, one of the foremost researchers on foundational literacy, and somebody who's really been acknowledged as a resource person across the world. Her body of work is tremendous. In fact, if I actually start speaking about her work, then we can spend the next 40 minutes talking about it. But that's where it is. But I think special thanks to her for really joining us for interaction. And then we have Ashish. Ashish Jalani is the head of international markets for Square Panda. So these are our panelists, but without further ado, let me just get into the conversation. Dr. Nag, I would like to start with you. You know, like listening to, you have seen the report, and of course you have heard Dr. Debroy's comments in terms of like what needs to be done, how we really need to look at things. What are your initial ideas on what do you think is right or what is wrong with this body of work? How do you think we can actually do it? And especially if you really look at it, languages is an important aspect that we have to look at. So like, as we say, India is a multilingual country and every Indian could speak multiple languages. So there is that whole learning aspect that also comes in. But first the report, then on the languages. Over to you, Dr. Nag.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion. Like Dr. Debroy, of course, I acknowledge that this is an important initiative, and like him, I do have a lot of issues with it. But I'll just speak on one, which is linked with the languages, the question on multilingualism. I suppose one of the indicators that could have easily been brought into this would be the multilingual status of each state. States are variously challenged by the number of languages and dialects that they have to address. And if we have said we are going to nurture all the languages within any of our contexts, then you might want to use multilingual density of a state. as one of its indices of the challenges it faces. And then you might want to look at disaggregated data on the linguistic groups within the states, because that itself gives you a sense of what some of the most deprived sectors in terms of access to resources. But talking to your question on us being a multilingual country, we have multilingual education as our priority. I'd like to just go back to the issue of not the system, but that is the ecology of language use and language value. And within that, I'd like to think of the child and the conversation partners to the child. If you're thinking of foundation literacy, it's useful to think of how do we impart it? And it's useful to think of literacy as standing on the shoulders of language. And then it's useful to think of, do we really give children the space to talk? What do we talk with our children? What is the oral language boost that our curriculum needs? One of the ways in which my surveys have attempted to understand this is to simply to ask whether a school believes in a monolingual rule. And school after schools appear to think that the best way to teach a child the language of instruction is only to speak to the child in the language of instruction. So the question that Dr. Debroy brings about what were the questions asked in these surveys, and also in which language? And was the language kind and gentle to the child's knowledge base, or was it silent and not acknowledging of the child's knowledge base? One of the issues, of course, is then about beliefs, our beliefs about how children learn. Parents' beliefs that children will learn the school language better if they stop using the home language. Teachers' beliefs that they should instruct parents to not use the home language too much so that there's practice of the school language. None of this actually is about multilinguality. It's about making our country monolingual depending on which state we are in. In terms of the main issues that I think the thematic analysis would tell us from any multilingual country, including India, is the marginalization and alienation of languages. So would you have any way of making an index out of that? That's an important indicator of what might go wrong in our ambition to be able to make every child have access to what they need. The second issue, of course, you have this, which is access. And in my way of looking at access, it's not just access to schooling, but access to variety and literacy artifacts and numeracy artifacts. So it's the variety as an index, not simply having something available. And under variety, it could simply be that, do you have a class library? Do you have access to more than just the textbook? Do you have access to more than what is available within the library, but in your neighborhood? So community-based literacy supports. In terms of multilinguality, I just want to make two other points. One, that multilinguality is natural for a child. It's not yet natural for our teachers to nurture it or our systems to acknowledge it. So we do really need to look at what are the multilingual ways of delivering education that teacher training must address. The second is a tendency within our education reform to have centralized curricula, which has no space for variation to dialectic differences, to local realities. So I would like to propose that every state that decides to go into an education reform considers 30% of its curriculum for preschool or for the early grades as allowing regional variations and allowing that to become a systematic way of addressing local realities, from folk tales to local games to local ways of thinking about teaching and learning. Finally, the last point I want to make is that I think if we want multilingual education to be at the core of our new effort, consider starting and launching a social media campaign on what we mean by multilinguality, what we mean by nurturing multilingual in the home, in the school, and for the child. Thank you. I think you're mute, Amit.
So thank you, Dr. Nath. Dr. Sanwal, I'll just moving forward with the conversation. Dr. Nath has made some very important points. But what do you think? What India can do as a nation in terms of investing in early grade learning? What do you think we can do? You've been at the forefront of really driving a lot of change. You've been at the NCERT and you've really been looking at these things. So what's your view in terms of what we need to do as a country?
Yes, I agree with most of the points that Professor Nag has made, and I'll just tell you what the ministry and what NCERT is actually doing to address those challenges. So first of all, for the teacher training bit, the first shift that even your report highlights is that we are talking about balanced literacy approach, where we are really focusing on the oral language development to begin with, and that forms the basis for all other language and literacy related activities. And we have launched a teacher training program called Nishtha FLN, wherein we have dedicated modules on multilingual education and what teachers need to do and how teachers need to address the challenges of multilingualism in the classroom. And NCERT curricula as such is the states are free to adapt and adopt as per their local contexts and needs. And we are also doing a lot of activities related to toy-based pedagogy, wherein we are focusing on more on local folk tales, local toys, and trying to bring them back and focusing more on experiential learning, activity-based learning. And so the pedagogy, we're really focusing on a change in the pedagogy of foundational years. And in the Nipun Bharat, you have seen that earlier, the foundational years, the Anganwadis were very different, and the schools would start from grade 1, or like 2 years of preschool was there. But in the Nipun Bharat, we have tried to create a continuum so that there is a smooth transition for a child from preschool to grade 1, 2, and 3 and further. So we are trying to build a continuum and trying to address the whole 5 years of foundational years together. So a lot of focus on teacher training, wherein we are also focusing on parent and community involvement in these areas. So, and of course, how children learn and focus on the pedagogy, etc., is there we're trying to address all those challenges. So you're muted.
Thank you, Dr. Sanwal. So just moving ahead on the conversation, Ashish, what Dr. Sanwal was saying is about importance of pedagogy, what are the various tools that are actually getting used. And for you working in the area of EdTech, how do you really look at pedagogies as we really move ahead? How do you think foundational learning can actually be made, or people can really go through this whole exercise through EdTech? Over to you, Ashish.
So, first of all, I agree, right? What NCERT is doing, what Sir mentioned, right? Foundational learning is very important. Now, one of the bigger challenges that happens in the field, right, on the ground when we're there in Chhattisgarh or any other state, but when you talk about rural, is the infrastructure, right? So when we talk about, we have Nishtha or we have Diksha or any other platform, the accessibility to that platform has to be available. Like Sir said, it doesn't have to be in the classroom on a tablet or a smart board. It could be on a mobile, but still the accessibility is still a challenge, right? If you look at even the phone penetrations with the teachers, etc., a lot of these places, 30–40% of them don't even have a smartphone still. So how will they even access this on a phone? Right. So there is one challenge, is that accessibility when we see it on the ground. And obviously that's being dealt with all the states investing heavily in bringing infrastructure for the teachers, for the classrooms, etc. The other side, when you talk about pedagogy, right, when you talk about toy-based, activity-based learning, etc., the key challenge is what ma'am identified is we want to make sure that the teachers understand the importance and then they're trained to actually impart that to the child, right? Because that's your biggest challenge. It's not that we change the curriculum for the children first. It's actually the teachers themselves need to be changed first, right? They need to be trained well enough in these new pedagogies. They need to understand the importance of it, right? It's not important only just to teach the child the curriculum of the book, but how do you also teach that is very, very important as well for the teacher. So I think those areas, Amit, are where we need to concentrate on first. I think I know we want to do everything in parallel, but I think what would work is if we took that approach where we looked at the teacher and like ma'am mentioned, even the community, because the child is in the school only certain amount of time. The rest of the time, maybe COVID or not, they're either with parents or they're in their community. So how do we actually get the community more up to speed with these kinds of things? And it's maybe just making them more aware, but at least those kinds of efforts have to be put in beyond just the child with the teacher, with the community around them. So ultimately it all drives the child's learning, right? That's what we're all shooting for. But I think starting there would work better.
Very, very interesting, Ashish. But let me get you neatly into the conversation. Like what Ashish is saying is the importance of EdTech and things, but how do you think EdTech has changed the way we read? You've done some work in the area that is an important element to really look at. And then, of course, it is also about foundational learning and literacy, numeracy. In fact, what Dr. Debroy was saying, that how COVID is possibly affected. And this is one of the challenges that we are really seeing. So over to you in terms of what it means for, say, curriculum designers in this whole age of what has happened in the last 2 years. It might actually be a great learning experience for everybody. But over to you, Nidhi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kapoor, and thank you so much, Ashish, for those insights. One thing that one finds when you look at either the practices in the field or when you look at the kind of research that is being done on how EdTech is leading to the way an average individual is reading. I mean, I'm not even talking about children right now, but a very critical impact has been that we are all turning into distracted readers. The way the information flows and the way the information changes, we are all moving or hopping, or what you call the grasshopper brain, hopping from one part or a kind of an information onto the next. So, and that is something, this distracted reading, that has affected not just adults, but children, and more so, because this is something that they're being exposed to right at the beginning. What's happening is probably that, when we talk of foundational learning, it's not enough to say that a child should be able to read a content and say understand at a superficial level. I think what we need to focus on as a nation is to create these thinking readers, to allow or to develop those capacities in children to be able to pick up a text, to be able to go beyond the text, to be able to infer, to be able to critically analyze, evaluate, say in their own words what their thoughts are. And a fear is that the way in a digital medium, the information that changes so quickly, that probably the children are not getting used to the habit of pausing for that extra fraction of a second to be able to, really apply their mind, to be able to infer, think, and, articulate or pause and reflect. So I would sort of say that it's not the tech that's a problem. It's not the tech that's an issue at all. What probably the issue or a challenge I would say comes up is when we talk of EdTech, we look at the tech part, but we sort of grossly miss the ed part. So now all of us understand, and there has been enough research on neuroscience now, which tells us that, and also what is mentioned in the Nipun Bharat guidelines, to say that a child learns to read best, let us say, through a balanced approach. Now, when we say a balanced approach, in all academic sense or a practical sense as well, it means that a child should have enough opportunities for oral language development, where the child is asked to, like I said, articulate in her own words and analyze and evaluate and speak up. And so and of course, this includes largely the space that a child's language is given into the entire development process. But then on the one hand, you're talking of oral language, then you also have to focus on the orthographic skills and of course, like Dr. Nag also said, to make sure that a lot of literature is available. So I think what misses out is that people, and like Dr. Kapoor, you said, what does it mean for curriculum designers? Is largely people tend to focus on one aspect. You know, you find people passionate about a certain kind of an idea, and that's what they try and implement. So for all curriculum designers, I think it might be important to focus on ensuring that a balanced approach is followed, or making sure that the child gets enough comprehensive experience, which focuses on orality, orthographic expertise, ensures that a lot of variety of text is available. I think the ultimate challenge that curriculum designers face is to make sure that we create content that helps our children become thinking readers and not just a superficial literacy, as you say. Over to you.
Nidhi, you make a very important point, and that is on thinking readers. And in fact, this is where I would like to go to Dr. Nag. Like your body of work is possibly wherein you talk about languages, you talk about research into and you're really doing research in the area of Akshara languages. But now my question here is, like, when you're talking about creating those thinking readers or whatever, how do you think training in languages and the appropriate and the right level of training in languages can actually be helpful? The second thing is that if you really want to achieve foundational learning by 2026, 27, what are some research questions or priority areas that we need to really look at as a system, as researchers, and as policymakers? Dr. Nag.
Thank you. I suppose the first point to make is that a lot of evidence that we are drawing on is on alphabetic scripts, and even your report tends to use a lot of the evidence that's come from other writing systems. Now, is there an issue of depending on other writing systems to make decisions for the Indian scenario? If you think of children's learning, there will be universals, and up to that point, it is quite fine to look at the evidence base coming out of other countries and other contexts. But I think for a country of the size of India, with its diversity of scripts, it's essential that we have our own research program in the Akshara languages. So if you're asking me about one area that research has to go into, it is to understand what are the ease points and pressure points within each of the Akshara languages of the country. For example, it's not the same if it's Hindi versus Tamil, or it's not the same if it's Kannada versus Bengali. So we don't seem to have enough research there. There is enough for us to start, but I think a concerted effort in the next 4 years, and we should be able to have a good patchwork quilt of what's happening across the different languages in which we are offering instruction in the country. So that's absolutely an urgent requirement, requiring oversight from a body that is interested in FLN as a research topic. The reason I say that is urgent is because we have excellent labs within the country, but the measurements are different and it's hard to actually do any kind of comparison. So if we want a meta-analysis of what's happening within the country, we need in the next 4 years to launch a coherent program of research that makes it comparable across all the Akshara languages. Now, in terms of what is our biggest challenge, I mean, I'm not going to talk about governance, which is one of our biggest challenges. I'm not going to talk about the absence of variety and resources, which is another big challenge, or the need for stopping to think that teacher training is a one-day affair or a 2-day affair. Teacher training, as already spoken about by Dr. Sanwal, is about an ongoing process. But what I'd like to talk about is the child who we want to become a thinking reader. Every analysis of the child's profile of skills shows us that our instruction creates fragmented development. Some aspects of the child's skills develop, other aspects of the child's skills are ignored and they wash away and fade away. Those wash away, fade away effects are instruction effects. They are not because the child can't have developed those skills. Important among the ones that are being lost are their spontaneous skills for inference making, their spontaneous skills for extending their knowledge and generalizing. All of these are actually lost because of our exam system and what we allow and engage with in the classroom with the child. So if we are interested in reaching our target of thinking readers, we should be thinking about what is the fragmented development that's happening and what can we do to right that. So when I think of this topic of balanced literacy approach, I think the balanced is not so much about the reading wars or phonics or whole language. The balance is about ensuring inference making is a part of our curriculum. The balance is about listening to the child's voice. The balance is about bringing the local into the curriculum. The issue about research questions, one can think of it from the writing systems angle, which is what you asked me about. But I'd also like to think about it from the fact that literacy occurs within an ecology of opportunities or disadvantages. So if there is a research agenda that goes beyond what the child is learning, I think there's an urgent need to understand preferred literacy practices in our schools. And why is it that these literacy practices have persisted? Why is it that these literacy practices make sense to our teachers? Teachers do things because they believe it helps. Do we need to throw it all out with the all new curriculum? That is a recipe for disaster because it will not stick. We really not need to go with the culture of each of our schooling hubs. We need to understand why teachers do what they do. We need to understand, can that be incorporated? And here I'll bring up three things that teachers have often said they would like to continue doing. One is that they would like to continue copywriting work. Second is they would like to continue drilling. And third is they would like to continue choral work, which means children working together and doing things. Now, are there aspects of literacy learning that can gain from these three practices, or do they need to be thrown out? I think these are issues to be discussed. This is not the forum for that level of academic discussion, but definitely these are kinds of research questions that need to be asked. And one last point, if we are prioritizing FLN, I think we need to understand what we are aspiring for. Are we aspiring for bringing the child who's struggling to a level of average? Or are we aspiring for all children having the variety that will allow them to bloom at their own pace? Some may not catch up with the average, but that doesn't matter because what matters really is that FLN allows for confident children where all children have the ability to engage with the artifact they are comfortable with, one of which happens to be the literacy artifacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nag. This is very, very important. But Ashish, building up from what Dr. Nag was saying, so my question to you would be, what kind of solutions do you think we can look forward to in the near future to ensure that every child learns to read fluently with comprehension, especially in the area through EdTech or through technology?
Well, so I mean, that kind of makes the answer easy, right? What technology brings, and I think everybody's mentioning this, and everybody talks about it. Every child is different. Every child learns at its own pace. There's contextualization, there's localization, etc. Now, with technology, especially if the technology is available and you start looking at what we call today as adaptive and personalized systems, we can actually devise each child's journey differently and in different localizations and different contextualizations as well, right? And that's what technology brings, right? And the other part which most people talk about is, that's the child, but we can do the same thing for the teacher as well, right? That same technology applies to what the teacher can use as a tool in the classroom. So the technology isn't brought in to replace, but it's more brought in to help that teacher have all this contextualization, understand what each child's strengths are, weaknesses are through technology, through that data that they have. And then ultimately we drive a solution to the child through this adaptive and personalized system.
And great.
Can I ask?
Yes.
As Professor Nag has rightly pointed out that writing is also very important nowadays. And during this pandemic era, the most suffered thing is this preschooling, which cannot be basically during these online classes can be for elder children, but not for small kids. And nowadays, everybody is talking about that oral speaking and reading, but nobody is focusing on writing, which is the most crucial part for preschooling time and for small kids. And in this pandemic era, we have seen that kids have forgotten to how to write, and though they have their ideas, they can read the book, but they can't write. The writing is also a measurable side where one should focus.
Thank you, Pawanji. In fact, Dr. Sanwal, I would like to just pick up the question from what Pawanji had actually said. How do you think, what do you think is NCERT doing, or what do you think, what would you like to say that NCERT is doing in really taking care of the learning loss that might have actually happened in the last couple of years? Because the last 2 years have been fairly challenging across the board. As Dr. De Bruyne also said, it is not just about class or foundational learning, it is across the board that we've actually had those challenges and across the world. So it becomes very important that we really focus on that area, and it will have to start at the basic level itself. Dr. Sandra.
Yep. So I think we don't really agree with the term learning loss, because we feel that learning is not really lost, but there could be a gap in the continuum of learning. There could be a gap for which I think we are ready with the bridge course, which from preschool to grade 8. And we had initially under the RTE, we had proposed it for, we had started developing it for out of school children, but then technically every child is out of school, So this bridge course, which is based on the learning outcome, I think we are ready with that. And in addition to that, we have come out with alternative academic calendar during pandemic, where we gave guidance to the parents and the community and the volunteers as to what kind of activities they could take within their homes or community to engage children, and to, of course, through activities also cover the learning outcomes, so that kind of guidance was there. And and coming back to the question about writing in preschools, I think we have to acknowledge that just to leave a child free to draw is the beginning of writing, So just leaving the child free with the pencil and let him draw and talk about the picture and talk about the drawing is the first step towards learning to write, So I think that is because we often feel that only when the child starts writing alphabet that he starts writing. So we have to understand that we have to give opportunities for drawing and expressing and talking about the drawing, and then slowly it turns into writing. I think that kind of acknowledgement is important.
Thank you, Dr. Sanwal. In fact, just as we are moving towards closure of our discussion, Nidhi, I would like to ask you this important question, and as a top-up question to the conversation. There have been critical challenges, or there are some critical challenges that may prove to be hindrance to achievement of foundation learning. And I think I have to agree with Dr. Sanwal that it is about, there is a gap in continuum of learning. So maybe that's a better way of really suggesting it. But those are separate issues. But how do you think foundational learning goals as set in Nipun Bharat guidelines, how can we really achieve them? How do we really go about doing it? Given the state that we are in, or given the positive things that we are really looking at, and there is a positive momentum, but where do you think we can go?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Kapoor. In fact, it's pretty wide, and I probably, given the time constraints, would have to restrict myself. So when you talk of challenges that could be there in the achievement of us, of us going NRGV Foundation Literacy and Numeracy by 2026-27, of course, there are challenges at the systemic level. We have probably inadequate budget or the resources that go into making sure that children have enough resources, the infrastructure, teacher recruitment, nutrition, not using data enough to inform our practices, policy. I think those are some systemic challenges that we would need to address And more so in context of the whole Nipun Bharat guidelines, the fact that now foundational literacy is being looked at as a continuum, 3 years of preschool and then followed by grade 1 and 2, which right now is under 2 different ministries. Probably there will have to be some kind of an alignment between these two. So yes, while there are enough systemic challenges in terms of infra, budget, different ministries looking at different components, there are a lot of challenges that make it difficult for us to achieve the quality as well. While we have achieved gross enrollment ratio, while most of our children are in schools today, which is a big achievement for us, given where we were about 60 years back. But the fact that the focus on quality, sadly, it has been missed in the last so many years. If you look at the Anganwadis, they have turned into what you call the khichdi centers, unfortunately, where again the focus on the preschool component is not there. You have the teaching learning processes now existing, like Dr. Nag was saying. There are certain practices that teachers prefer and would want to continue following them. Some of them may not be as useful as one would hope it to be. So the kind of teaching learning process we have is very focused towards rote learning, rote memorization, all of these reading wars that exist today, which confuses a teacher more than ever. You of course have the issues of teacher professional development, the kind of curriculum that's there for pre-teacher education, the B.Ed courses, the DLED courses. You look at the curriculum, they seem to be, there's a huge need for us to revise those curriculums as well. And of course, COVID has added on to all of those challenges. I think while challenges are many, but wouldn't want to sort of end it in a negative note, because I think where we are right now, and given that this mission has come at a very appropriate time, and given that the government focus now is increasingly on foundational literacy, I think this is the right time to make sure that we divert our resources, we focus on the quality, we support the Anganwadis to ensure that there's enough quality material available. Like Dr. Nag said, we will need to focus increasingly on research and development. We will have to build up our teachers. We'll have to make sort of an environment where we support the teachers more, a mentorship to the teachers. And of course, one last point that I want to make is we need to be very cautious of this inclination towards the so-called remediation packages. While COVID has brought in a lot of challenges, again, research shows that given that this loss has been for 2 years, it is not as simple to cover up the loss. And we will have to be very cautious and try and not do efforts where we try and claim to say that the loss can be covered in a period of 3 months. I think this requires very intensive efforts. This requires a sort of a curriculum restructuring at all levels, teacher preparedness, children preparedness, to make sure that all of us come together and get the children at least first on a base level and then build it up from there.
Thank you, Nidhi. In fact, on this note, I would like to go back to Dr. DeBroy. Sir, if you have any closing comments, you've heard the conversation, the importance of the idea, and things like, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Amit, and thank you, Amit, and the Institute and all the others who have contributed for doing this first report for us. Congratulations and thank you. It's an important issue. I am not going to be overly critical again, but I do want to make a slightly different point. So everyone present here knows we've got 41 indicators under 5 heads. Educational infrastructure, access to education, basic health, learning outcomes, governance. Implicitly, the desired objective, said notwithstanding, is learning outcomes. So that's what I'm looking at. That's what I'm trying to get. And in some sense, these 4 heads, they are like inputs into the process. Educational infrastructure, access to education, basic health, governance. So the immediate policy suggestion would be, all right, improve educational infrastructure. Now, if it's that simple, then why don't Maharashtra and Gujarat do that well on learning outcomes? Because they do well on educational infrastructure, they should be doing well on learning outcomes. If access to education is what I need to do, then why doesn't Assam do that? Because it does scores highly on access to education. If basic health ensures that I do well on learning outcomes, why doesn't J&K, which does well on basic health, perform in learning outcomes? And if governance, as defined here, drives learning outcomes, then why doesn't Uttarakhand do far better? In other words, what we're talking about is a very complicated story. And I think the substantive point about this report, which is the critical input for future one, is this is essentially too statistical. It is statistics and data driven. It doesn't give me a feel. Access to education. Access to education is obviously going to be easier in a relatively homogeneous state like Kerala. It's going to be much more difficult when habitation sizes are less than 200. It's going to be much more difficult in a geographically diverse state, large state with nomadic populations, even like Rajasthan, Arunachal Pradesh. So I'm not capturing that difficulty in some sense. I don't know how you factor that in. Earlier point was made about languages. But in some sense, I need to capture that difficulty. More importantly, I think the next time the report like this is done, it will be enriched and we'll have a better understanding. If going beyond statistics, it looks at mini case studies of what worked and what did not. For instance, I know, well, this was some years ago, I know that treasury management, one example of treasury management, what do I mean by that? In Jharkhand, the Anganwadi worker would first have to pay out of her own pocket and then get reimbursed. In Gujarat, the money came first. Now, the mere fact that I have to first spend that money and get that from Ranchi was a big nuisance. Maybe it's changed. I'm just citing this as an example. So next time, maybe let's have some mini case studies. So we understand what is going on. And what is going on is sometimes not at the level of the states. It's at the level of the districts. It's at the level of the blocks. So wonderful report. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Debroy. This is just very interesting conversation. Great insights from everybody here. Special thanks to our panelists, Nidhi, Dr. Nag, Dr. Sanwal, Ashish, and very, very special thanks to Dr. Debroy and Pavanji for really enabling us and entrusting us in doing this important body of work. It's been a privilege to really work, and I think a great learning experience, and we look forward to really making this better as we go along, and we have continued moving towards some level of excellence or perfection as we move along. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Debroy. Thanks, everybody. Be well and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.